Welcome to another deep dive. And this one, well, it's on a topic that I think we all know a little something about, loneliness. But trust me, there's a lot more to it than just, feeling alone. We're going to really get into it, the emotional side of it, the physical side, even get this, some philosophy thrown in. For this deep dive, our source material really takes us on a journey. It looks at the mechanics of loneliness, how it affects us, and most importantly, what we can actually do about it.
It's kind of funny, right? We talk so much about being physically alone when loneliness, it's really about something else entirely. It's about this lack of real connection, that feeling of being invisible or like nobody gets you, even when you're surrounded by people.
Yeah, the classic picture of someone at a party. They're surrounded by all these people, but they're off in their own world, completely isolated. Our source makes a really good point about this. It's not about the quantity of connections, it's about the quality. Have you ever felt that way? I think we all have at some point.
Absolutely. And the thing is, that feeling of disconnect, it can really take over. It kind of feeds into this sadness, maybe even emptiness, which then, of course, just makes us withdraw even more. It's a vicious cycle, really, and it affects us, it affects us everywhere, mentally, physically.
And that's where things get interesting, really interesting, because the source material talks about the physical impacts of loneliness. And honestly, it's scary. It actually compares chronic loneliness to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. In terms of health risks, that is. That comparison, that's serious, right? I think it really shows us just how deeply loneliness can affect our health.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. Chronic loneliness, as crazy as it sounds, can be as harmful to you as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And the reason? It triggers this constant stress response in your body. It's like your body's stuck in overdrive. And over time, high levels of cortisol, that stress hormone, they can lead to a whole mess of problems. High blood pressure, trouble sleeping, even a weaker immune system. It increases your risk for things like heart disease, diabetes, even Alzheimer's later down the line.
So we're talking long-term serious consequences here. It's not just something we're imagining. It's impacting our bodies at a really basic level. And when you think back to that emotional side we were talking about, it really shows you how connected everything is.
Oh, absolutely. The emotional and physical aspects of loneliness, they're intertwined. They feed off each other. That sadness we feel, that urge to withdraw, it can lead to these physical problems, which then, of course, just makes the loneliness worse.
It's like this downward spiral, makes you realize that we can't ignore these feelings,
Yeah.
We have to do something about them. But then the source takes things even further. It talks about how other people see loneliness, like the social perceptions around it. And that adds another layer to everything. Because it's not just how we feel, it's about how we think others see us.
There's this sense of being unseen, unimportant, and it's often tied to this fear of rejection. What if you reach out and people judge you? What if they push you away?
It's like you're on the outside looking in, even when you're in a room full of people. The source gave this example. Someone hesitates to join a conversation because they're afraid they'll look awkward or unwanted. And the crazy part, that hesitation, people might actually see it as disinterest, which just leads to more isolation. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, in a way.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important point. Loneliness, it comes in different flavors, you could say. The source breaks it down into 3 types: emotional, social, and existential. Each one, it's kind of got its own personality.
Okay, so let's break those down. I think understanding those nuances can be really helpful. So first, what do we mean by emotional loneliness?
So emotional loneliness, it's that ache you feel when you're missing a truly close connection, someone who gets you, it could be a partner, a sibling, your best friend, someone you can truly be yourself around.
Yeah, that person you can call at 2 a.m. when everything's falling apart and they just get it. No
Right.
judgment.
Exactly. Then you've got social loneliness. This one, it's more about feeling like you don't belong to a larger group. This
Okay.
one can be tough for people who move around a lot, or maybe they've experienced different cultures. It's that feeling of not finding your people, your tribe.
Again, that sense of being on the outside looking in, even when you're with others.
Yeah.
And then there's the big one, the existential loneliness.
Yeah, existential loneliness, it goes beyond just missing certain people in your life. It's that feeling of being alone in the universe, truly alone. People dealing with this, they often find themselves asking those big questions. What's the meaning of life? Why are we here? It can be a heavy weight to carry, for sure.
Wow, yeah, that's some deep stuff.
Mm.
But before we get too philosophical, I want to shift gears a little. Let's talk about what we can actually do about loneliness. Because the good news is, it doesn't have to be a life sentence.
Absolutely not. It's important to understand how complex loneliness can be and how much it can affect us. But we can't forget that we have the power to change things. We can build connections, find support, and really shift our whole experience. It's about taking those feelings and doing something with them.
So where do we even begin? The source suggests starting small, like joining a group that shares your interests. Why do you think that's a good first step?
Well, when you do something you enjoy with other people, it creates a natural way to connect. It could be a book club, a hiking group, volunteering at an animal shelter. Whatever it is, it gives you a shared experience, and that opens the door for conversation.
It takes the pressure off trying to force those first interactions, right? You already have something in common.
Exactly. As you participate, you might find yourself opening up a bit more, sharing your thoughts and feelings. It's a gradual process, building those connections brick by brick.
Speaking of sharing, the source also talks about expressing yourself creatively, like journaling, art, music, that kind of thing. I find that fascinating because it's not just about processing emotions. It can also connect you with others. Why do you think people share their creative work? Especially when it can feel so vulnerable.
It's about putting a part of yourself out there and seeing if it resonates with someone else. And sometimes those unexpected connections, they can be the most meaningful. But the source also points out that sometimes you might need a little extra help, professional help, that is.
Right, like when those negative thoughts just won't go away. The source specifically mentioned CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. How can that help with loneliness?
CBT is great for changing those negative thought patterns that contribute to loneliness. It helps you challenge those beliefs you have about social interaction, those self-defeating ones. And it gives you healthier ways to cope.
So if you're always second-guessing yourself, avoiding social situations out of fear, it might be time to talk to a therapist. There's no shame in seeking support. In fact, it shows strength and self-awareness.
It can be a total game changer when it comes to how you experience loneliness.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. The emotional, physical, social aspects of loneliness.
Yeah.
We even touched on some potential solutions. But we still have that big existential question looming. And this is where things get really, really interesting, I think.
It is fascinating to look at loneliness from a philosophical point of view. The source brings up some heavy hitters, like Kierkegaard and the existentialists. They saw loneliness as a fundamental part of being human.
So not just a fleeting feeling, but something woven into the very fabric of our existence. Now, that's a thought-provoking concept.
It is, isn't it? It's like if we're all experiencing it at some point, then in a way, it connects us. You know what I mean?
So instead of loneliness dividing us, it actually, brings us closer. That's almost like a contradiction, isn't it?
It is a paradox, but a powerful one, for sure. The source material suggests that solitude, which often comes along with loneliness, can actually be a good thing. It can be a source of strength, of growth even. Thinkers like Rainer Maria Rilke, they believe that solitude, it gave you this space, a space for deep thinking, for creativity, even for connecting with your true self.
So we can look at those moments of solitude not as something to be afraid of, but as opportunities. It's about using that time alone to discover yourself, to reflect. That's a really powerful way to look at it.
It is, and the source even goes so far as to say that the pain of loneliness, it can be like a guide. It points us toward what really matters in life. It highlights that need for connection, for purpose, for meaning.
Like a wake-up call.
Right.
Telling us to take a look at our lives and make some changes. Changes that line up with what we really value. But how do we go from understanding that in our heads to actually, feeling it and making those changes?
Well, the source material, it gives us some concrete strategies. One big one is to make introspection a regular practice. Journaling, meditation, spending time in nature, anything that lets you disconnect from the outside world and really tune into what's going on inside.
I like that. It's like making a date with yourself.
Yeah.
Blocking out time to just be with your thoughts and feelings without judging yourself. And it doesn't have to be this big, complicated thing. Even 5 minutes a day can make a difference.
Oh, absolutely. Small, consistent steps. That's the key. Another practice the source recommends is doing things that foster creativity, self-expression. Could be painting, writing, playing music, dancing, anything really. The goal is to tap into that imagination, let yourself express freely, no pressure to perform or please anyone.
Finding that flow state, right?
Yeah.
Where you're just completely absorbed in something you love. And you never know, maybe sharing what you create could lead to those deeper connections we've been talking about.
You're right. It's all connected. And lastly, the source really stresses the importance of self-compassion.
I think that's especially important when we're talking about loneliness. It's easy to turn on ourselves, blame ourselves, wonder what's wrong with us. Why can't we connect with people?
It's a normal reaction for sure, but we have to remember, everyone experiences loneliness. It's part of being human. Beating ourselves up just adds to the pain.
It's like kicking yourself when you're already down.
Yeah.
Instead, we need to be kind to ourselves, understanding, just like we would be with a close friend who's struggling.
Exactly. Acknowledge the pain, validate the feelings, and remind yourself that you deserve love and connection, even when you don't feel it.
It's about giving yourself permission to feel those emotions without getting stuck in them.
That's it.
So, just to recap what we've talked about so far, existential loneliness, yeah, it's tough, but it can also be this incredible opportunity, an opportunity for self-discovery, for growth. We can use solitude to reconnect with ourselves, figure out what's important to us, and cultivate that self-compassion.
And by being ourselves, truly ourselves, and being vulnerable, we open the door to deeper, more meaningful connections. Connections with people who get us, who we truly are.
It's all about realizing that loneliness, in all its forms, is something we all share.
Instead of letting it control us, we can choose to see it differently. As a chance to grow, to connect, to understand what it means to be human, really.
This has been so insightful, but I also want to talk about like practical strategies, things we can do in our everyday lives to deal with loneliness. Philosophy is great, but sometimes it's hard to put it into action.
I agree. We need tools, techniques, things we can use every day to break out of that isolation and build those connections.
So let's dive into some of those actionable steps, starting with vulnerability. This one can be tough, especially for people who've been hurt in the past.
The source emphasizes that vulnerability. It's the key to real connection. It's about letting people see you, flaws and all, trusting that the right people will appreciate you for who you truly are, letting go of that need to be perfect, to present this polished image. It's about authenticity, really.
And that authenticity, that's what draws people in, right?
Yeah.
It creates that space for real connection, for intimacy. But how do we actually practice vulnerability in a way that feels safe? Because for a lot of people, the idea of just putting themselves out there can be really overwhelming.
Start small. It doesn't have to be anything big or dramatic. Share a personal story with a friend you trust. Tell someone you care about how much you appreciate them.
Those little acts of vulnerability, over time, they build trust and closeness.
It's like building a bridge, one piece at a time. As you get more comfortable being vulnerable in those smaller settings, you might find yourself opening up more naturally in other areas of your life.
Another practical strategy the source talks about is social engagement. It might seem obvious, but it's about making that conscious effort to connect with people, even when you don't feel like it. Because the more we isolate ourselves, the harder it is to break out of that cycle.
It's like a muscle. You got to keep using it to keep it strong. The more you practice social interaction, the easier it gets. And again, it doesn't have to be a big production. Talk to someone new at the coffee shop, call a friend you haven't spoken to in a while, join a club or group that interests you.
It's about putting yourself out there, creating opportunities for connection, even if it feels a little uncomfortable at first. Every interaction, even a short one, it contributes to that sense of belonging, of community.
For sure. And speaking of putting yourself out there, the source also suggests focusing on acts of kindness, service to others.
That's interesting. How does helping others make us feel less lonely?
When you focus on someone else's needs, it helps you step outside of your own head, your own problems. It also gives you a sense of purpose, meaning, and those can be powerful antidotes to loneliness. Like they say, the best way to cheer yourself up is to cheer someone else up.
And there are so many ways to be kind, to help others. Volunteering, donating to a cause, even just helping out a neighbor. Those acts of kindness, they create a ripple effect of positivity for both the giver and the receiver.
And they remind us that we're all connected, part of something bigger than ourselves, which can be really comforting when you're feeling isolated.
This brings us back to taking care of ourselves, our physical and mental well-being. It's easy to neglect that when you're struggling emotionally, but it's so important.
It's true. When you're depleted physically and mentally, it's so much harder to deal with loneliness. It's like trying to run a marathon on an empty stomach. You just don't have the fuel. So make sure you're sleeping enough, eating well, exercising. Do things that bring you joy and help you relax.
Those self-care practices, they're like building blocks for resilience. They give us the energy and strength we need to handle those tough emotions and build relationships.
Exactly. They give us what we need to navigate all of that.
So to sum it up, we've looked at some practical strategies for dealing with loneliness, being vulnerable, engaging socially, acts of kindness, and taking care of ourselves.
All valuable tools we can use to break free from isolation and create a life that's more connected, more fulfilling.
It's been a great conversation so far. What are some key takeaways from this deep dive that really stand out to you?
I think one of the most important things is that loneliness, it's not a sign of weakness. It's a universal experience, something we all go through.
It's so easy to internalize those feelings and blame ourselves. like we're flawed somehow or not worthy of connection. But this is not true. It's important to realize that we're not alone in this, and that asking for support, reaching out for connection, that's a sign of strength, not weakness.
Right. And we have to remember that loneliness, it's influenced by a lot of things. Societal norms, personal experiences, even our biology. And that brings us to another key point. We have the power to change things. We're not helpless when it comes to loneliness. We can choose how we react to those feelings, and we can take action to create a life that's more connected and fulfilling.
We can change how we see things, challenge those negative thoughts, and build meaningful relationships. And it starts with taking that first step, even a small one.
Yeah, that's a really good point about building up that loneliness immunity. I like that analogy. So, like, in terms of practical stuff, what are some things we can do every day to make that happen?
Well, it's not just about feeling better. It's about creating an environment where those real connections can actually grow. And it really does start with the basics, getting enough sleep, eating healthy food, and moving your body. We often forget how much those things affect our mood, our energy, even our ability to think clearly and connect with other people.
Yeah, it makes sense. If you're running on fumes, it's no wonder you feel withdrawn, disconnected. Exactly. It's like expecting a car to run without gas. And on top of those basics, it's about finding activities that genuinely bring you joy. Things that help you de-stress. That could be spending time outdoors, reading, listening to music, maybe picking up a creative hobby, something that really excites you.
It's about figuring out what fills you back up, what makes you feel more alive. And I think when we feel good about ourselves, it shows, we give off a different energy. And I think that makes us more open to connecting with others because we're not coming from a place of emptiness.
Absolutely. And that self-care, it also means setting boundaries, learning to say no to things that drain you, that leave you feeling depleted. This can be tough, especially for people who are always putting others first or who have trouble saying no.
Oh, I know what you mean. It's so easy to get stuck in that people-pleasing mode.
Right.
But we have to remember, we can't give to others if we're running on empty ourselves. Taking care of our own well-being means we can show up better for the people we care about.
Exactly. Maybe it means saying no to some social events, delegating tasks that are stressing you out, or just taking some time for yourself each day to recharge.
So self-care isn't selfish, really. It's actually a way of being generous to ourselves and to others.
It's a journey, not a destination. It's about making choices every day that support your well-being, physically, mentally, emotionally.
And those choices, over time, they lead to a more fulfilling life, a more connected life.
Like building that strong immune system we were talking about.
Yeah.
Helping us deal with the ups and downs of life and those times when loneliness might try to sneak in.
This has been such a great conversation, really eye-opening. As we wrap up this deep dive into loneliness, any final takeaways that stand out to you?
I think it's so important to remember that loneliness isn't a sign of weakness. It's a human experience, a normal part of life. We all go through it, and there's nothing to be ashamed of.
We put so much pressure on ourselves to be happy and connected all the time, but recognizing that loneliness is a normal emotion, just like any other, can be really liberating.
Absolutely. And maybe even more importantly, we have a choice in how we deal with those feelings of loneliness. We can let them take over, or we can use them as opportunities for growth and connection.
We can change how we see things, challenge those negative thoughts, and build those relationships we all need. And it starts with taking that first step, no matter how small.
Reaching out to a friend, joining a group, practicing self-compassion, each step takes us closer to a richer, more connected life.
This deep dive has been amazing. It's given us a whole new understanding of loneliness, how complex it is, but also how it can be a catalyst for growth and connection.
It's a journey for sure, and even though there might be some lonely moments along the way, those moments, they can be valuable too. They give us the chance to reconnect with ourselves, to discover our strengths, and ultimately to create a life that has more meaning.
Well said. As we wrap up this exploration of loneliness, I want to leave you with this. If loneliness is part of what makes us human, how can we use it for good? How can we turn those times of isolation into chances to grow, to connect, to understand ourselves and the world around us better?
That's a really powerful question. And maybe the answer isn't about getting rid of loneliness altogether. Maybe it's about learning to deal with it with kindness, with courage, and with a belief in our own ability to bounce back.
I think you're right. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into loneliness. We hope this conversation has given you some new insights and encouraged you to take action. Until next time, keep exploring, keep connecting, and keep embracing everything that comes with being human.